Hi, I'm Thomas Broadhead. I'm the editor of the Critical Performance edition of the Ives Fourth Symphony. And in this video, we're going to talk about the thrush calls in the fourth movement and also the interesting role of the pitch A sharp in the symphony. Previously, we talked about there being two sketches to the finale, the second far more developed than the first, and also a reworking of the ideas found in the first. Well, there's an interesting notation that's found in both sketches, and that's the word thrush, which appears right in front of what works out to be little thrush calls that would appear in the flute and oboe. And they occur in three different spots in the fourth movement in measures 32, 64, and 72. And here we're looking at a sketch towards what became measure 64 in the edition. And here's the word thrush. And here's this da-ba-ba. Now, it also occurs in the second sketch, which is the basis for the edition. And here you have, in what would be measure 72 in the edition, the second flute playing this thrush call. And he writes it in ink this time. So we can be really confident that in all those cases, he was thinking of the thrush, which is a bird that Ives would have heard frequently in New England. Now, what does this look like in the score? So here are the three places where you can find the thrush calls in the fourth movement. The first is at measure 32, where the thrush calls are labeled appropriately. And then Wayne Shirley and Jim Sinclair both thought it would drive the point home if the ending of each little call, bump, 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 had a little flutter tongue on it. So it was dump, bump, brr, like that. So it would sound more like the actual call of the thrush. And so, it's an editorial interpolation. The flutter tongue is not by Ives, but we thought, well, it's not going to be editorial violence per se if that's added in. So let's do it, but to make clear that it's editorial, we're setting it in brackets. So we have bracketed tremolo slashes and a bracketed instruction for it to be played with a flutter tongue in each case. All right, so that's measures 32 and 33 where it's found. It's also found in measure 64. Once again, it's the same instruments, flute and piccolo, and this time an oboe also joining in. And the last place that it's found is at measure 72 in the second flute. And that corresponds to that place where Ives wrote the word thrush in ink in the second manuscript sketch. The presence of the thrush calls in the fourth movement actually helps explain the inclusion of a quote at the end of the third movement fugue that precedes it. And that's where the trombone comes in at the very end of that movement and intones from Joy to the World, let heaven and nature sing, let heaven and nature sing, do. So why is that there? Back in 2003, when conductor Stephen Smith was preparing to conduct the Ives Fourth with the Oberlin Orchestra, and he was consulting with me, and we were having great conversations about it. I explained that the thrush calls were present in the fourth movement in these certain lines, and they hadn't really been identified in the 1965 score, but they were going to be brought out in the new score. And almost simultaneously, we had this epiphany. We realized, oh, well, then they're what the trombone is referencing. Here in the fourth movement, you have heaven, the distant choir, the heavenly host, as Ives calls it, perhaps Halley's Comet, and nature, these thrush calls, are singing together in call and response format, right? So here are the thrushes, and then here's the celestial heavens, and then they go back and forth. So this, again, points at just how rich the score is and how, the program itself will manifest for you in places where you least expect to find it. But in this case, it was always hiding in plain sight. About halfway through my travels with the symphony during this period of collecting real-world feedback, I was contacted by a young conductor who was working on a doctoral dissertation on the symphony. This conductor's name is Michael Jacko, and he had two really interesting insights into the symphony that I had not encountered before, and they're ideas that are worth disseminating. The first of the 2 points in Jacko's thesis that I find really striking is that there seems to be ground for an interesting parallel between the program of the Ives Fourth and the program of Dante's Divine Comedy. Now, at first, this may seem like a stretch, but consider this. The name of the second movement in the Ives Fourth is comedy, right? Well, the original name of Dante's Divine Comedy was just comedy, commedia. And what's going on in Ives's comedy? Well, it's a tone poem, right, on the Celestial Railroad, which is a bitter satire of Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, which is charting the travels of this pilgrim, right? Well, here Jacko explains that the second, third, and fourth movements would seem to correspond with the travel from hell through purgatory to paradise, right? But he goes on, to say Ives's prelude parallels Dante's prelude through the shared exposition of a pilgrim seeking guidance from the stars, and each of Ives's subsequent three movements represents a cantica from a structural standpoint. And he goes on from there, and just the parallels are really interesting. And provided Ives's interest in literature and his studies with Phelps, it would seem likely that this might have been on his mind when he was mapping out the symphonies. So it's something to consider, and Jacko explores it in some depth. The second point that Jacko makes in his thesis has to do with the role of the pitch A sharp that is found throughout the symphony. And he begins by looking at the hymn text that is sung in the first movement, the Watchman hymn. And he focuses on the line, "See that glory beaming star." Okay, so let's start there in the full score. Here we're looking at the corresponding page of the full score in the first movement, where the chorus sings those lyrics, "See that glory beaming star," and at that point, the solo piano reaches up and grabs this high A sharp and punctures the air with it. And you can hear it really clearly in almost every recording. And Jacko's thesis is that A sharp is the glory beaming star. It's the thing that you're seeking. It's the pole star. It is the cynosure. After that, A sharp starts popping up in really interesting places throughout the piece. The next prominent use of A sharp occurs at the beginning of the second movement. After that initial misty and dreamlike opening with the sounding of the train bells and the piano, on the second page, we enter the land of destruction in the Celestial Railroad story. And there, Ives gives us a treatment of the hymn Martin, Jesus, Lover of My Soul, in quarter tones. And you'll see that the top violins, not the two soli, but just below it, the top violins of the main section, are playing the main melody of Martin, starting on an A sharp quarter tone. So there would be the glory beaming star right there in Jacko's thesis, presented at the very beginning of the movement. And this possibly represents, the pilgrims assembling before, the train takes off without them. Then, at the end of our Celestial Railroad journey, we end at Beulah Land, where Ives gives us the hymn Martin once again, but this time in the solo piano in F sharp major, with A sharp as the starting note of that melody. Dum, ba, 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 bum, ba, bum. And then, to drive home the Beulah Land program here, we have the hymn Beulah Land being played by the solo violin, also in F sharp major. Bum, bum, ba, bum, 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 ba, bum. So again, we have this A sharp that's being, presented very prominently. And notice that it's in the very same octave that it was at the beginning of the movement when the violin section was playing Martin in quarter tones. So have we gotten any closer to the glory beaming star by taking the Celestial Railroad? No, we're the same distance from it. It hasn't changed. We're right there on the ground still, and we haven't achieved our goal. Also note that this is not the end of the movement. The movement ends with the narrator waking from his dream to the sounds of 4th of July celebrations at Concord. So we've never left the ground. We've always been right there on planet Earth, in Concord in reality, and then on this hellish train in our dreams. So this movement provides a false answer, the first false answer, to the question posed by the chorus in the prelude, in which the idea is that earthly pursuits will not move us any closer to spiritual enlightenment. And so this does jibe with and Jacko's thesis, as well. Before going forward, let's quickly revisit the opening of the prelude, where we have this very ominous declaration in the solo piano low strings, starting on a D, right? And astute listeners and students of the piece will know that this is repeated, slightly altered, at the beginning of the finale. Here is the first pitch you hear in the finale. It's the low basses intoning Bethany, near my God to thee. And you would think that Ives would have written B flats here for the da, 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 da. But instead, he's pitching every B flat as an A sharp, curiously, right? Well, that fits in with Jacko's interpretation. It moves on to the next page where Ives does more the same, and this actually kind of cements it. Here we have that intoning of the opening of the symphonies, or bringing it back, and he's starting it not on D as he had in the prelude, but on A sharp, and everything is shifted, chromatically. And in the very first sketch of the fourth movement, the sketch that is not the basis for the present edition, Ives casts this starting on D. And it's in the second sketch where he shifts it down to A sharp. So again, he really is thinking about this pitch specially. And then driving it home, if you go to the very end of the symphony, what do you get? Well, the topmost violins play this chord in harmonics, the highest note of which is an A sharp. And over the last measures, as we go through measure 84 and on, the violins begin dropping out one by one until there's only one left, playing that high A sharp. So the finale begins with A sharps, low, and the contrabass, and then it ascends all the way up to the heavens to this high A sharp and the solo violin. So there seems to be fertile ground for an analysis of the symphony in terms of the pitch usage that Ives has employed, with this A sharp having this very prominent role as the glory beaming star.